Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. We're now going to start the program with the recitation of Quran. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والسماء ذات البروج واليوم الموعود وشاهد ومشهود قتل أصحاب الأخدود والنازعات وقود إذ عليها قعود وما يفعلون بالمؤمنين رشود وما نقموا منهم إلا يؤمنوا بالله العزيز الحميد والله وظالم والذي له ملك السماوات والأرض والله وضع المحيط والله على كل شيء شهيد إن الذين فتنوا المؤمنين والمؤمنات ثم لم يتوبوا فلهم عذاب جهنم ولهم عذاب الحريق إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ذلك الفوز الكبير إن بطش ربك لشديد إنه هو يبدئ ويعيد وهو الغفور الودود ذو العرش المجيد فعال لما يريد هل أتاك حديث الجنود فرعون وثمود بل الذين كفروا به تكذيب والله وضع المحيط والأمر وضع المحيط وهو القرآن المجيد في لوح محفوظ.
Salawat again. Allah. Thank you so much for that beautiful recitation. And today we're very fortunate to have Nazmina Dhanji, who will be speaking to us on the topic of Tafsir through the ages, how our scholars continue to develop their method of Tafsir through time. Let's welcome with Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Many of you will know Nazmina. She's the founder of Arabiq Online, an author, and she's the former associate lecturer in Islamic studies at Al-Mahdi Institute. She completed her degree in Arabic at SOAS, including modules in translation, Qur'an and Hadith Studies, as well as a number of other topics. After spending a year in Damascus consolidating her knowledge of Arabic, she went on to pursue further Islamic studies at Jamiat al-Zahra in Qom. She's translated and edited a number of works and subtitled documentaries in films from Arabic to English. And her current areas of interest are Arabic language, grammar, Islamic ethics and spirituality, as well as Tafsir, Hadith studies and interfaith relations. And she's published a number of different books, and you can see more online. So we're very fortunate to have her today. Again, salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
سورة المباركة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. صلوات. Respected elders, sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's always a pleasure to speak at Mahfil. And the choice of topic is a bit on the scholarly side, but inshallah it won't be, inshallah it'll be suitable for the audience, because as far back as I know, Mahfil has always been a place that's prioritized tafsir. As far back as I can remember, Sunday morning tafsir classes have been there. And it's a community that's always valued the Qur'an so much and always valued delving deep into the Qur'an. So, tafsir is something that's been honored by this community for a very long time and consistently. So today I thought I'd give us a bit of background into the history of tafsir and also moving forward what tafsir looks like. So how our scholars continue to develop their method. So I'm going to kind of take us back first and do a whole overview of the subject of tafsir, inshallah. So firstly, before I actually go into what is tafsir, I don't plan to make all of it interactive, but just with a show of hands, how many of you can think of more than 3 to 4 tafasir that you know? Yeah, more than 3 to 4. So, or that you have access to? Yeah, more than 7. More than 7. Okay, 1, 2 people. More than 10? Or that you could name more than 10? That's counting. Okay, so let's delve in. So what is tafsir, first of all? Okay, so tafsir is... One second. Sorry, my slide's not catching up. So tafsir is translated as interpretation, explanation, commentary, exegesis. These are kind of interchangeable words in English, right? Any of these will be used to explain what tafsir is, but specifically in terminology, it's explanation or commentary of the Quran, right? So if someone just says the word tafsir, you can pretty much guess they're talking about the Quran. And the Quran itself mentions that it's a book not only to be recited, but also to be explained, right? So this ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah says, even as we've sent among you of yourselves a messenger to recite our signs to you, to purify you, to teach you the book and the wisdom, and to teach you what you didn't know, right? So there's various layers of the Quran that the Prophet was to uncover, right? He wasn't just there to recite it to them, but he was there to teach them the book and explain its teachings. And the way that it's different from tadabbur, right, which we're also supposed to do, is the reflection on it, the pondering on it, the drawing lesson out of it. So whilst tafsir is a very scholarly endeavor, explaining it, and as you will see, there's lots of qualifications of who a mufassir is and what a tafsir scholar has, tadabbur is upon all of us to do, right? So the Quran says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not ponder on the Quran, or are there locks on their hearts? So the understanding is that we should be pondering on the Quran. We should be thinking about it, right? This is the book we've revealed to you, abounding in goodness, that they may ponder the verses. And only those who are endowed with understanding can ponder its signs. So again, there's this understanding that when people recite, they are pondering. So going into the history of tafsir and where it first started, right? When does tafsir, or the science of tafsir, date back to? So it dates back to the earliest days of Islam, right? And the Quran encouraged the practice itself, introducing the Prophet as the interpreter. So it says, with clear arguments and scriptures, we've revealed to you the reminder that you may clarify to men what has been revealed to them, and that they may reflect. So the Prophet, the way that he explained the Quran was by alluding to other verses of the Quran, right? So he would turn to other verses of the Quran to elucidate the meaning. The Ahlul Bayt and companions after him would refer to the sayings of the Prophet and how he used to teach ayat of the Quran. There were also examples of rational deductions and things like that. And some tafsir scholars then began to produce commentaries based on a hadith, based on other ayat of the Quran, but there were also others who attempted to interpret Quran of their own, right? And impose their own meaning on the Quran, speculating without proofs. I think it means this, or I'm sure it means this, or in my opinion, this is what it's saying. And this has been kind of disparaged and condemned, what's known as tafsir bil-ra'i, right? So imposing one's own opinion on the text of the Quran. It's been condemned. and expressly forbidden by all schools of thought, that you can't just impose your own opinion without kind of proof, without hadith, without recourse to other Qur'anic ayat. And many scholars discuss different methodologies about how they approach the Qur'an in their works, and they explain their methodology usually in the introduction to their works. So let's just quickly have a look at the qualifications of a mufassir or a tafsir scholar, right? So the prerequisites that we have of tafsir scholarship. So first and foremost, don't know if you can read it, is a correct approach towards it. To see it as not just any book that you would open and read and research into, but to approach it first and foremost as a book of sacred knowledge, right? That has to be, you have to have a degree of spiritual awareness, a degree that you're dealing with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The fact that it's called Huda lil Muttaqeen, those who are conscious of Allah, right? And it opens itself to those who have that consciousness. Otherwise, they don't access the depths of its meaning. So that correct approach is really important. Secondly, knowledge of Arabic grammar, syntax, morphology, linguistics, the context of Quranic vocabulary in relation to literature, the Hijazi Arabic of the time and how it was used, knowledge of historical contexts, so pre-Islamic Arabia, Judeo-Christian narratives of when it came down, knowledge of different harmony between the verses and other ayat to do with the same theme, Quranic sciences as a whole, so which verses abrogate other verses, which verses are general, which verses are specific, the occasions of revelation, when was this ayah revealed, when was that ayah revealed, early Islamic history, pre-Islamic history, knowledge of which verses are clear, which verses are ambiguous, which ones are Makki, which ones are Madani. Also a very strong foundation in usul ad-din, awareness of the disparity of opinions throughout the ages, right? Which verses have been controversial, which ones have led to differences in opinion and things like that. And also for someone to have an unbiased approach, free of preconceived notions and judgments, awareness of various scientific theories, for example, philosophical theories, etc. So there's a lot that a tafsir scholar needs to know, right? Understanding of legal verses, what the differences of opinion are. And that's why it takes them such a long time, right? To write these tafsir works, is because there's so much that goes into it for them to take into account. Also the ability to analyze, chains of narration. If they're using proofs from a hadith, the ability to be able to authenticate a hadith, analyze chains of transmission, differences of opinion on them, etc. So it's definitely not been an easy endeavor to just write tafasir. And like I mentioned previously, there's various methodologies that mufassirin go through, right? And what we mean by methodology, or what is a methodology of tafsir, is simply the process that they employ to interpret and derive meaning of Quranic verses, right? So what is the process that they go through? What exactly do they use to derive that meaning of an ayah of the Quran or ayat of the Quran? So there's various different methodologies, and there's 5 to be precise, okay? So there's what's known as tafsir riwa'i, right? Where you're essentially using riwayat or narrations or a hadith to explain what the meaning of an ayah is. There's tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, right? So using other ayat of the Qur'an to explain a particular ayah. As tafsir aqli, right? Where you're using rational methods of deduction to explain an ayah. Tafsir ilmi, which is a scientific approach to it and using science. And tafsir ishari, which is mystical, elusive, esoteric, and things like that. So we'll go through each of them in turn as to how they've been used throughout the ages and what each of them means or looks like. So tafsir riwa'i, narrative methodology, is one of the earliest and most prevalent methods, right? And I'd say that for the most part of history, this narrative methodology or tafsir riwa'i was the most prevalent. It's also known as tafsir bil ma'thur or tafsir naqli, right? Sometimes there was such a radical tendency towards this methodology that there were some mufassirin who completely rejected any other way. It was just a hadith. So for example, Tafsir al-Ayashi, so this one's a translation of it. So Tafsir al-Ayashi is one of the earliest tafasir that we have, and it wasn't even complete. Part of it was lost, so it was only up until the end of Surah Al-Kahf that existed. And this Al-Ayashi was alive at the time of Ghaybat al-Sughra, right? So it goes way, way back. So you're talking 3rd century after Hijrah. And when you look at the way it's arranged, you don't hear the voice of the mufassir. There's no commentary by the actual author. Ayashi doesn't comment himself. There's no kind of, when you look up any ayah, there's no commentary by the author saying, I think this means this, or in conclusion we have this. And all it is a list of ahadith, right? So what they would do is they would collect ahadith at their disposal and then just list them underneath the ayah that they were dealing with, right? And that was tafsir. It was a list of, and at time, as time went on, the commentaries increased, right? Then they would comment about the hadith itself, but it wasn't a lot more than that. As you'll see in the timeline that I share with you later, things progressed later on as they started to include more tools that were at their disposal. But this was very typical of a tafsir naqli, right? Where it's just a hadith mentioned. And you're welcome to have a look at it afterwards. So they use a hadith from the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam in order to explain the content of the ayat. And again, it's closely linked to what the Quran says, that the Prophet was there to clarify what was revealed to them. So naturally, it meant that you used a hadith. So they say the earliest work in this field, of course no longer extant, was the Mus'haf of Imam Ali. So where he had notes in the margin to explain the ayat of the Quran. Again, there various companions throughout the ages had these little notebooks that they had these ahadith to do with ayat of the Quran. So the ayat that would be used, that would be kind of authentic narrations, would be, for example, explanation of difficult terms, right? So you would have, for example, such and such a companion went to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and asked him the meaning of this word in this ayah. What does the word basiqatin mean? And he explained it means tawil, it means tall, right? So sometimes you would have a hadith to do with explanations of difficult words. Sometimes the ahadith would be to do with legal rulings, right? So many things. Even salah, for example, the Quran doesn't detail what salah looks like, how it should be, how many rak'at, what we should recite. That's all from ahadith, right? The ahadith elucidate and add the details. Explanations of occasions of revelation, right? This ayah was revealed at the Battle of Badr. This ayah was revealed after their defeat at Uhud. This ayah was revealed, at such and such a place or at such and such an occasion. Explanation of even the correct method of tafsir is explained by a hadith. And various Qur'anic sciences, how some ayat abrogate others, and everything that we know about the Qur'an has come from a hadith. And there are many ahadith actually that aren't valid to use in tafsir. So generally, scholars have argued, and Shias especially, that it's only a hadith of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim wasalam that you can use as to explain other ayat, right? Not necessarily reports from companions that may say certain things, right? So the Shia are more hesitant to include opinions, tafsiri opinions of companions, and they divide them into various levels of authenticity, right? So for example, statements about the meanings of Quranic words is acceptable, right? Provided that person wasn't actually knowledgeable about classical Arabic grammar or philology. Or, for example, if someone says, I was with the Prophet at this time and this ayah was revealed, right? Again, it's about the occasion of revelation. It's accepted provided that a companion was actually witness to the event and generally was a trustworthy narrator. And then general narrations about the Prophet's words and stuff, that's subject to authentication. So you treat asbab a hadith to do with tafsir the same as you treat any other narrations. They have to go through the stringent process of authentication. And then statements issued as personal interpretation. So if a companion said, I think this ayah meant this, or in my opinion, the ayah was referring to this. So they'll respect it. They may quote it, but it doesn't carry authority in and of itself. Not like a statement of the Ahlul Bayt would. Whereas Sunni scholars do accept it. So these are some of the important kind of tafsir riwa'i works, and there's loads of them. This is just a very short list, right, that we have that you see. I'm not going to read all of them out because they're basically just titles and scholars, but I would say this is maybe just a fraction of it, okay, that have been written in this kind of style. Some of them with more commentary, some of them with less commentary, but the basis of it is narrations, okay? Then the second methodology that we came across was Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. And this method relies on the notion that each part of the Qur'an explains another part of the Qur'an, right? And that you can best understand the intention of the author, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by looking at how he uses that same word in another part of the Qur'an, right? And it's one of the oldest methodologies of tafsir, going back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. So, for example, once he was asked from this ayah, those who have faith and do not mix up their faith with dhulm. So someone asked him, what does dhulm mean in this particular context? And he said, referring to another ayah, most surely polytheism is a grievous dhulm. Inna shirka la dhulmun azim. Right? So he said, deriving the meaning from another ayah, that in this instance, faith was polluted with shirk. Various other examples, right? So Imam Ali alayhi salam, kind of drew out that the shortest term of pregnancy was 6 months, comparing two ayat. Or Imam Baqir explaining the shortening of prayer using two different ayat, right? So they would do that. They would take recourse in other ayat of the Quran to explain that. So again, the validity of this methodology goes back to the Quran, right? We've revealed the book to you, clearly explaining everything. So parts of it explain other parts. And we mentioned the example of the Prophet, specific narrations, and also logically, like we said, the key to understanding any text is to study conforming parts of it side by side. And throughout history, Sunni and Shia scholars have said that this is probably the most correct methodology of tafsir, looking at other parts of the Quran, and it makes sense. So in terms of what application of it looks like, so it's referring, for example, indefinite ayat, which is known as mutashabih, or it's ambiguous, unclear, a little bit obscure, verses that seem a bit cryptic, they're referred back to definite verses, right? So for example, ayat to do with Allah having hands, Allah having a face, right? Anthropomorphic ayat are always referred back to definite ayat that say, laysa kamithlihi shay, right? There's nothing like him. He is not like others. You can't see him. Distinguishing general verses from specific verses, right? So, for example, the ayah came down, marry women that seem good to you. But then it would qualify it with specification to say, but you can't marry the women that fathers have married before you. Or, for example, there'll be general verses or vague verses versus clear verses, right? So I'll talk about, for example, the cattle, quadrupeds are lawful to you, right? All cattle are lawful to you, except what will be revealed to you afterwards. And then revealed afterwards is, this is what's forbidden. You're allowed this, and this is forbidden. So things would be clarified later on. Oops. So important Shia tafsir works that use this methodology predominantly, Al-Mizan fi Tafsir al-Quran, right? So that's Allama Tabatabayi's work, focuses very much on Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. So he does, it's not that he doesn't use narrations, but he quotes narrations, again, after verifying authenticity or mentioning them, but his predominant methodology is Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. And various other ones. Also Tafsir al-Tasneem by Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli. Sorry, excuse me. The next one is Tafsir Aqli. So again, this is a rational methodology. And again, this possesses a long history, right? So it's been kind of described, defined in different ways, but it's what's known as ijtihadi. It's using our own aql and using reason. So of course you consider narrations, you consider, the etymology of words, philology, inference, logical arguments to clarify meanings and things like that. And the validity of it is, again, ayat of the Quran themselves that clearly say, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, right? أَوَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Why do they not apply reason? Thank you. Why do they not apply reason? Why do they not think? And it's believed that the Prophet himself taught people how to apply their reason when they would come across ayat of the Quran, and how to make sense of them. And again, when we'll come across the timeline and we'll see that, again, the role of reason in both fiqh as well as tafsir has gone through various kind of ups and downs. There have been scholars that have relied on reason and accepted it as a very valid source of extracting legal rulings, of explaining the Quran. And then there's been scholars throughout the ages who've been, very much against using reason, right? So we'll see that there have been times when it's peaked in Shia scholarship, and there's times where it's troughed. And there's many tafasir where it's actually the product of an aqli methodology. For example, some of Mullah Sadra's writings and other tafsir works, also in Al-Mizan and Tafsir Tasneem. Then you've got Tafsir Ilmi, which is a scientific methodology. So scientific here means actually recourse to empirical sciences, right? So there's so many ayat of the Quran that we find that refer to science, refer to nature, the natural world, cosmology, etc. And this is a methodology that's come up very recently, obviously, with modern discoveries in science, etc. So, but it was still there in the past. So in the first period, from kind of the 2nd to the 5th century, Tafsir Ilmi came into play when Greek works were being translated into Arabic, right? So scholars such as Ibn Sina kind of endeavored to interpret some ayat of the Quran in light of Greek discoveries and the Ptolemaic system. The second period, from the 6th to the 12th century, again, there were various scientists who advocated that the Quran contained all sciences within it, and all the sciences were included in the Quran and could be derived from it. And then the third period, from the 18th century onwards, is when experimental sciences started kind of being developed in the West. Various books were translated into Arabic, physics, chemistry, medicine, astronomy, etc. And that's what inspired Muslim scientists to compare the Quran against these. And there were many more kind of works written on the Quran and science. So again, there were different types of scientific tafsir that came up. So for example, there was this view that all sciences can be derived from the Quran, right? From algebra to huruf al-muqatta'at, people would look for kind of patterns in mathematics, kind of deriving medicine and healing. And there was no necessary kind of solid basis to this theory that every science and everything could be derived from the Quran, right? And so proponents of this kind of theory faded. There was also some who imposed scientific theories upon the Quran. So for example, there was one particular theory that when Allah says He it is who created you from a single being, and then He made His mate that He might incline to her, right? So one commentator explained the nafs as the proton and the zawj as the electron, asserting that Allah has created us all from protons and electrons. So things like that, there would be an imposition of scientific theories onto ayat of the Quran. And again, it kind of gave tafsir a bad name, essentially, because of this imposition without any basis. And the other way, which is the accepted way, is understanding the Quran via science, right? So drawing conclusive scientific facts that agree not with some alluded meaning from the Quran, but just from the apparent meaning. So for example, like the barrier between two seas, or the planets being in their own orbit, or things that don't take so much kind of mental exercise to get to the crux of. We're almost there. So again, in order for scientific tafsir not to exceed the bounds of validity, it has to adhere to specific criteria. So firstly, it's got to be done using concrete scientific facts, not just theories. Secondly, the relationship between the text and the scientific issue must be clear, can't be imposed on the verse. And you've got to, again, be very careful not to attempt to fit ayat into scientific ideas. And that there haven't been kind of concrete, complete tafasir on just an ilmi methodology. Again, because the whole of the Quran doesn't allude to scientific things or the natural world necessarily, right? So there's no complete tafsir of the Quran using just an ilmi methodology. Tafsir ishari is what's been referred to as esoteric, Gnostic, mystical, Sufi, it's called shuhudi tafsir, right? And it's got kind of minor differences, but it's basically the assertion that there's hidden meanings and hidden depths to the Quran that are different to the apparent meaning, right? So generally, tafsir deals with the zahir al-Quran, the apparent meaning of the Quran, and this attempts to kind of go beyond, to infer meaning, to kind of find esoteric issues that aren't immediately apparent from the text. So this, they say it began early on in the 2nd century, and it's validated by sayings of the Prophet that suggest an esoteric interpretation. So there have been various different approaches, right? So there's, for example, the intuitive method, which is it borders on tafsir bil-ra'i, right? Where the individual interprets the Quran according to what they say are mystical unveilings, witnessing, visions, and that kind of thing. So they're not bound by Zahir al-Quran, by what the Quran is actually saying, right? So Sufis, Gnostics, mystical experiences, spiritual states, inner feelings, right? And this approach is based on a private religious experience, so it lacks authority, and it's not deemed valid for Quranic tafsir. So this, what's known as faidi tafsir or intuitive tafsir, is not deemed valid. There's other Gnostic interpretations. So Imam Khomeini was an advocate of Gnostic interpretations. And he said it was just a byproduct of tadabbur, right? When you did enough tadabbur, that you drew lessons from it, and it wasn't the same as personal opinion, right? But he just saw it as an esoteric look into the ayah. And then there have been esoteric tafsir of the Ahlul Bayt. So Allama Tabatabai goes into this in detail when he quotes certain ahadith that the Quran has layers and dimensions, right? So some of the layers may not be known to us just yet. So looking at these 5 methodologies, the important thing to note out of all this is that none of them can be used exclusively to interpret all ayat of the Quran. So most scholars will use a mixture of everything, right? A mixture of at least 2 or 3 of these methodologies to arrive at their conclusions. They each complement the rest. It's not like this is definitely better than the other, or, we're not going to touch a hadith. They all kind of complement each other to lead to the most complete interpretation. So they all make use of the necessary resources and tools at their disposal. and they represent kind of an organic growth of human interaction with the scripture, especially when you're using reason, especially when you're using, things like the natural world, when you're using human experience. And you find that the Quran then lends itself to different interpretations, different meanings throughout the ages, which we will see just now. So the most important comprehensive works that have used all these methodologies are Tafsir Majma' al-Bayan, which is kind of 5th or 6th century work, Makhzan al-Irfan, who was done by a female scholar, Banu Nusrat Amin, in the 19th, 20th century, 19th century, Al-Mizan fi Tafsir al-Quran by Allama Tabatabai, and Tafsir Tasneem by Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, which is still ongoing. So he just published the 71st volume of Tafsir Tasneem, of which they say there will probably be 80. So 71st volume has just been published of that. So aside from methodologies, there's also what's known as tafsir lenses. Okay? So tafsir lens are basically the different vantage points that a mufassir kind of uses to interpret ayat of the Quran. So some of these lenses are theological, right? So a mufassir can explore the Quran from his theological school in terms of his belief system, whether it's Mu'tazili or Ash'ari or various schools of Kalam, right? And they approach that from that particular lens, or a legal lens, right? So 500 ayat of the Quran are to do with legal things, inheritance and salah and Sawm and Hajj and Zakat and all the rest of it. So the approach is very fiqhi in that particular tafsir of how to derive the legal rulings. Or they may approach it from a philosophical angle, right? And looking at matters of philosophy, or a socio-political lens to do with justice and man as a social being, etc. Or a linguistic and grammatical lens, right? So looking at the meanings of words and their roots and, the rhythm and the meter and all the rest of it. So there's various different lenses that scholars have used throughout time. So just bear that in mind as we go through the timeline of tafsir scholarship. And this is just to give you kind of a whole overview of what's happened with tafsir throughout the ages. So if we start from the early days of Islam, where the Prophet himself was the mufassir, followed by Imam Ali alayhi salam, followed by his companions and family members, right? So early days of Islam. The first 2 centuries followed pretty much the same method, where they relied on a hadith to explain how the Prophet had dealt with certain verses in his own life, how he had acted upon these. And there wasn't that much difference between a muhaddith and a mufassir. Right? Hadith and tafsir were interchangeable. There was no such thing as kind of demarcating, this is tafsir and this is hadith. It was all the same, right? Because the Quran was primarily their book of life. There's references in later works that Abu Hamza Thumali had a book, for example, on commentary of the Quran, or such and such a companion had a book, right? Or what would have been a notebook. But none of those exist until now. In the 2nd to 3rd centuries came the first generation of mufassirun. So there were companions of the 5th and 6th Imams, and 7th and 8th, who had, again, notebooks. So there was no solid work on tafsir, but they had these notebooks where they would write down dictations from the Imams on particular surahs, or on particular themes from the Quran. 3rd to 4th centuries is where you see the earliest works devoted to tafsir, right? So this is looking at the time of Ghaybat Sughra. So there's a tafsir attributed to the 11th Imam, written by Al-Astarabadi, again, not complete, that we've got some remnants of. There's also Tafsir Furat al-Kufi, Tafsir al-Ayashi, like I mentioned. Ayashi was actually a Sunni scholar who converted and was a hadith collector. And he's the one who compiled Tafsir al-Ayashi. So, like I mentioned, it was very riwa'i in nature, right? It was just narrative tafsir, just mentioning a hadith, no commentary. You don't hear the voice of the mufassir. Also Tafsir al-Qummi. And in the Sunni scholarship, Tafsir al-Tabari was their first kind of concerted effort at compiling a tafsir work. Then you come to the 5th and 6th centuries, and that's when you have classical scholarship, right? That's where our classical scholars come from. Sheikh Tusi, for example, Sheikh al-Kulaini, Saduq, all were at that time the classical scholars who then broadened their approach to from just a hadith, right? That's when ijtihad was first born and came in. Rational deduction, personal commentary, comparing scholars' works, critiquing scholars' works, right? So there you have Tusi, who wrote a Tibyan fi Tafsir al-Quran. His student, Tabrisi, then comes up and writes Majma' al-Bayan. So he not only critiqued Tusi's work, but he added much more. So that was the first comprehensive one that we see, where he's included a hadith, he includes grammatical discussion, he includes Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, and it's a much more comprehensive work. You have Qutbuddin Rawandi, who writes Fiqh al-Quran. Again, it's like a departure from the general kind of just narrations, and he's actually examining ayat of the Quran and deriving fiqh rulings. 7th and 9th centuries, you saw a big decline in tafsir, and that's when the Mongol invasion happened. So lots of our libraries were actually burned. And you saw references to tafsir work that existed, but that didn't survive after that, right? So there were, many works by great scholars that we have kind of mention of, but that didn't survive to our time. Some of them that did survive at the time was Muhit al-A'dam by Haydar Amuli. So that was a kind of more of a Gnostic tafsir, a mystical tafsir, and also Kanz al-Irfan fi Fiqh al-Quran by al-Sayuri. So again, it was like the beginnings of looking at mystical tafsir. And then scholarship kind of was on the decline at that time. 10th and 11th centuries were the Safavid era. So that's where the Shi'as really flourished. And, especially in Iran, there was a kind of restoration of tafsir. And lots of works were written, but in Farsi, not so much in Arabic. So lots of Farsi works came up. There was a flourishing of legal commentaries, of fiqh commentaries, lots of philosophical, lots of mystical commentaries as well. There was a real rise of Gnosticism, Sufism, and things like that. So you've got Zubdat al-Bayan by Muqaddas Ardabili, Tafsir of Mullah Sadra, Tafsir al-Safi by Fayd al-Kashani. And again, you saw these comprehensive works, but that were very much more kind of spiritual and mystical in nature. And then in the 12th century, again, you see a drop in that Akhbarism came in. So Akhbarism was this movement that combated this rational thinking. And it was the rise of using akhbar or narrations again, that only the Ahlul Bayt had a voice, only they could be interpreters of the Quran, and people were not allowed to do that. So Akhbarism kind of turned things on their head, and it went back to using only ahadith. So you've got massive tafasir written, but again going back to just listing narrations. And sometimes ahadith would contradict each other in the same, to do with the same ayat, or sometimes they would contradict the Quran, but still it wasn't for us to comment on what that meant, because only the Ahlul Bayt knew best. By that time, there were so many more ahadith than when we started with, because there was a whole phenomenon of fabrication that had happened, right? So you had these huge compendia of ahadith. You had Wasa'il al-Shia, thousands and thousands of ahadith. Bihar al-Anwar, again, thousands and thousands of ahadith. So you see voluminous tafsir works with loads more ahadith than when we started with. But again, this kind of almost a decline. So they're good reference points because they include so many ahadith. But again, you don't find this rational deduction. So you've got Bahrani's Al-Burhan fi Tafsir al-Quran, and you've got Al-Huwayzi's Nur al-Thaqalain, both very famous tafasir. 13th and 14th centuries, so coming closer to modern day, you saw the Usuli movement come back up again, right? And that's Wahid al-Bahbahani was the one who kind of brought that back up. The renaissance of ijtihad, of using our brains, of using, rational deduction methods. And then, especially with the printing press, the availability of the access to works, there was then more demand from general people, from lay people, that they want to read. It's not just scholarly circles that had been before, right? There's more inclination towards social issues, more scientific exegesis. There's an appeal to a wider audience. That's when you had, for example, Al-Kashif by Muhammad Jawad Mughniya, Tabatabai's Al-Mizan, Banu Nusrat Amin's Kanz al-Irfan, and things are again coming back up to more comprehensive tafsir and much more being written. And also much more of a push towards a general audience, appealing to a general audience, not just the scholarly. And then in the contemporary, this century now, the 15th century after Hijrah, is actually considered the golden age of tafsir, because there's so much being written. In just over 25 years, there's more than 50 tafsir that have been written in the contemporary era, right? Especially following on from the Islamic Revolution, people's motivation to learn the teachings of the Quran, especially with Al-Mizan. When Allama Tabatabai wrote Al-Mizan, that was the impetus for people to write even more. Not that Allama hadn't been comprehensive in his approach, he had, but there are scholars who are now even developing further, right? Or critiquing and adding their own. You find now with tafsir works a much more systematic approach that have tables of contents, that have indices, that have maps. Some of them have images, but you find this rootedness in the Quran as well. So you've got Tafsir Tasneem of Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, Tafsir Namuna of Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, Sayyid Fadlullah's Min Wahy al-Quran, and a lot of these are several volume works. So what happened across this, to conclude, is this shift in perspective. So firstly, the shift in perspective on the status of narrations, right? You had this view that you could not interpret the Quran without narrations. Only the addressees of the Quran, only the Ahlul Bayt could. But now people saw that narrations were aids for understanding Quranic ayat, same as rational arguments, semantic arguments, language, philology, etc., and that the Quran had primacy. Akhbaris believed that ahadith were the weightier of the two things, so to speak. The ahadith superseded. If you didn't understand a Quranic verse and there were ahadith, you just had to leave it at that. Whereas the scales were kind of redressed in that the Quran took supremacy as the weightier of the two things. And anything that contradicted the Quran was set aside. The other shift in perspective was on the use of reason in tafsir, right? So you had the critics of rational tafsir, which were again the akhbaris. There was a saying of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam that said, certainly Allah's religion cannot be reached via the intellects, right? So that kind of shut down any intellectual reasoning. And, you know, obviously it was those who used personal opinion, not rational deduction. And of course, this was then overthrown. And the other important shifts are the very objective of tafsir, right? So what you find is that before, tafsir was very much an individual endeavor of attempting to understand and fathom Quranic ayat. Whereas now with comprehensive ones, it's much more a Quranic worldview, concluding what the Quranic worldview is, more conventional social viewpoints and things like that. So there's much more inclusion of topics like freedom, like social justice, you know, social corruption, Islamic economic system, and things that people can conclude from ayat of the Quran being written within tafsir works. You see the apparent form of the tafsir. What we're noticing now is a shift from using just chronological tafsir, going from Fatiha, Baqarah, Al Imran, etc., to more thematic tafsir. So people are writing themes, right? So for example, Tawheed in the Quran. For example, social justice in the Quran. For example, you know, and arranging them according to themes rather than in chronological order. Again, we said there's a shift in audience where they're writing for, you know, targeted towards, for example, youth. Sayyid Fadlullah's Min Wahy al-Quran is very much targeted towards a younger audience, towards youth. Same as, for example, Ayatollah Rafsanjani's work is targeted more towards youth, towards the common everyday person to be able to understand the Quran, not just scholars and academics. So there's a shift away from these analytical, lots of terminology used in their explanations. And like I mentioned, the chronological to thematic tafsir. So chronological tafsir is called tafsir tartibi, and thematic is known as tafsir mawdu'i. Okay, so now what we're seeing is this shift to the thematic. Before, you didn't have that so much. There were a few, like I mentioned, fiqh al-Qur'an, which, focused on the fiqh of the Qur'an, right? But now we're seeing much more of a trend in that. So tafsir that arranged in such a way that you could just pick it up, look for a theme, and know everything about that theme and all the different ayat that pertain to that theme. Whereas before, if I looked up an ayah, say for example about shaitan in Surah Baqarah, it may not, unless the author refers me to Surah A'raf and Surah Al-Hijr and all the different surah that also talk about shaitan, I may not know that as a layperson, that the Quran talks about shaitan in many different places, right? Whereas a thematic approach allows for that. So what we're finding is that the chronological was much more prevalent, and it was a more traditional approach. Majority of tafsir works take the chronological approach, right? You want to look up the tafsir of a certain ayah, you go to Surah Baqarah or Surah Al Imran, you look up the ayah, you find the tafsir, right? Some may refer to other ayah to do with that topic, some may not, right? And they'll go into deep analysis of the words, the sentence, the meaning, the context before and after, but you may still be left with gaps if they don't refer to other ones. But that was the more traditional approach. Now, like we said, it's more recent advancement in tafsir scholarship. And one of the proponents of thematic tafsir was actually Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. So he was a real advocate that we should be looking at the Quran in terms of its themes and going deeply into its themes and presenting it in that way. And he has a tafsir called Tafsir Mawdu'i al-Qur'an al-Karim to that end. The chronological tafsir were much easier to navigate in that you could just have the tafsir as a reference work and pick out the ayah that you wanted, look up the tafsir of it. Whereas thematic is much more conducive to researching particular themes and getting a thorough understanding, a fuller picture, a topic in real depth. In the chronological, your starting point was the text, right? So you start from an ayah, the text was your starting point, and you delve deeply into it. Whereas in the thematic, the starting point was the reality of life, right? It was the theme itself, the understanding of a particular topic, which was then kind of filled in with ayat of the Quran that meshed together tightly. In the chronological way, it would go into detail with the wording, the meaning, the context, real deep analysis, not necessarily and not always in context to other ayat. Whereas the thematic would investigate the relationship between different ayat and go sometimes even a step beyond tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. The important thing to remember is there's no conflict between the two methods, right? The thematic method uses the chronological method as a basis. There's so many tafsir works that have been written that a scholar that now goes into thematic tafsir doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't now have to go into that analysis because it's been done for them, and they can use that as a springboard to do thematic tafsir. Some examples that we have currently of thematic tafsir works are Mafahim al-Quran by Ayatollah Ja'far Subhani. So it means concepts of the Quran. Bayam al-Quran by Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi. Tafsir Rahnuma by Ayatollah Hashmi Rafsanjani. Like I mentioned, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr's tafsir, Tafsir Mawdu'i. And Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli also has a thematic tafsir of the Quran. So that's basically the scope that we have. And moving forward, the question remains is how do we access these? Which ones are in English? I'm hearing everybody ask, right? Which ones of these are in English? And unfortunately, not many at all, right? So this one that I translated into English, again, is just narrations. And I would say 90% of these don't have chains. We can't even authenticate which ones are authentic and which ones are not, right? So they give us a really good background into the history of the time. It shows us the backdrop of what was happening during the time of Ghaibat al-Kubra, Sughra rather, but it doesn't, it doesn't kind of go beyond that. So you've got Tafsir al-Mizan. Let me just see if I click on a link here, it won't work, right? No, that's fine. So if you go to, I think it's almizan.org, you've got Tafsir al-Mizan by Allama Tabatabai, which is being translated. So out of 40 volumes, there's only a few left to be translated into English. So this is probably the best resource that we have, the translations of al-Mizan. It's comprehensive, it's amazing, it's chronological, but he does refer very much to ayat of the Quran. And the other one that I swear by is the study Quran. So what Sayyid Hussein Nasr has done, and his colleagues, is that they refer to both, to tafasir, major tafasir from Sunni and Shi'i scholarship, and refer to them. They also cross-reference to other ayat of the Quran. So say, for example, that same example of shaitan. If you look up shaitan, when he first comes up in Surah Al-Baqarah, it'll tell you all the cross-references of where that incident of shaitan, expelling Adam and Hawa and all of that, where else it comes up in the Quran. So it's an amazing reference point. It may not go into detail, but it's got enough there to help us and be able to get a full picture if you also go through the cross-references. So the study of Quran is definitely a very rigorous work. Again, while you won't find the analytical, the breakdown of Arabic words, the roots, how that word has been used in pre-Islamic poetry, narrations and things like that, it's still a really good one to have. But yeah, for budding little scholars here, we need a lot of work done in tafsir. Lots of translations needing to be done. And I would say, look, now that the groundwork has been done in terms of the research into meanings and this and that, like I said, the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented. There's nothing that would stop us writing directly into English commentaries in themes, thematic tafsirs of the Quran, that would best suit our needs in our societies. So inshallah, I hope that's given you an overview and an understanding of it. Apologies if the topic was a bit dry.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We have some time for questions, if there are any questions from either side. This one now.
Assalamu alaikum. Question about what your thoughts are on integrating AI technology into tafsir. Not necessarily in the sense of trying to extract meaning or new meanings from tafsir, but more as a tool for users. I mean, from what I've seen at least, there are some Quran apps that have started to use sort of basic AI technology, but maybe something that integrates the various methodologies that you talked about, trying to approach tafsir as a tafsir mawdu'i, as you mentioned, really trying to integrate the various approaches of tafsir in a more sort of comprehensive way.
Yeah, I'm sure that there'd be so much scope for it, especially if the model is one of language models where it's able to research existing bodies of text in a much faster way and condense them into themes and things like that. I'm sure it would make our life a lot easier, where it's not inferring anything but simply consolidating and retrieving. I think that would be wonderful. The ones I've seen so far are mainly to do with recitation. Tartil.ai, I believe. Can't remember what else, where it corrects your recitation. But yeah, I don't see why not. I think it would be a good thing.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you so much for such a great and very interesting talk. It was really useful to see how it's changed over the ages. There was just, I remember one of the first slides was what some of the criteria for tafsir, and it said unbiased approach. And I think we are biased human beings, and there's absolutely no way we can ever be unbiased. No matter how many ahadith we draw on, there is a degree of personal interpretation. And the reason I mention this particular point is that most tafsir are done by men, and that obviously the male experience of life will be different from the female experience. And for me, I see this as an area that is missing in Islamic theology, that we don't have enough female scholars, and it's great to see you here. But I personally think that there needs to be, that there's room for more tafsir from a female lens to take into account the female experience. And I was wondering what you thought of that, and if you thought there were any other areas that need to be developed moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There are some contemporary scholars that have written, I wouldn't say whole tafsirs or anything like that, but they have their takes on specific ayat that pertain to women and things like that, and they have interesting takes on it. But yeah, I don't see why not. And I can't say I've read all of Banu Nusrat Amin's one, Kanz al-Irfan, that she's, her tafsir of it, and I would love to, because it's several volumes of work. But yeah, I think that would be very valuable, especially because there are so many ayat that address women, and there are so many ayat that make a point of saying al-mu'minin wal-mu'minat, and that, it's not exclusive to the male experience at all. And so yes, I think that's definitely something that's necessary moving forward, and that should be something that we endeavor towards. Yeah, such a good point. Alaikum salam.
You mentioned about Tafsir Ayashi, and I think a parallel in the Sunni Tafsir could be drawn with Tafsir al-Tabari. So for Tafsir al-Tabari, it is said that Ibn Kathir abridged that Tafsir, and he included all those chains of narrations at one. So is there any parallel to Tafsir Ibn Kathir in Shi'i Tafsir?
There's many and much more than that. So Tafsir Ibn Kathir, when you look at it, it's, yes, he developed, he used Tabari as a basis, and he developed on it, and then he included as, you hear Ibn Kathir's words, and that there's commentary and things like that. In ours, I would say there are many. I would say like Majma' al-Bayan of Allama Tabrisi, for example, which predates Ibn Kathir, but was much more comprehensive and acknowledged by both Sunni and Shi'i schools as being very comprehensive.
Isn't that linguistic based?
No.
It's
Riwa'i, linguistic, it's got rational deduction, Qur'an bil Qur'an. So, and that's looking at 5th century. Since then, we've got a lot more developed tafasir.
And another thing is, just wanted to point out that in Arabic and in Persian, a lot of tafasir have been written. But in Urdu, a lot of work has been done by Sunnis as well as Shias. And it would be good if some of the Shi'i tafsir work in Urdu is also translated in English, just like a lot of Sunni tafsir work has been translated into English. And I don't know, about, there's one Shi'i scholar in Pakistan who has recently completed his tafsir but not yet published. He is student of Ayatollah Sadiq Tehrani.
Okay.
And he has probably written that tafsir based on the same principle that Sadiq al-Tehrani, which is tafsir of Quran by Quran, that basis. So if such tafasirs are Shi'i tafasirs, if someone translate those in English as well, I think
Yeah,
that is
definitely.
what's needed.
Definitely.
There's Tafsir al-Kawthar by Sheikh Mohsen al-Najafi in Islamabad that is very popular nowadays among Urdu readers.
Yeah, no, this unfortunately I don't have that much knowledge of Urdu at all. my written and reading Urdu is atrocious at the moment. But yeah, I've limited myself to only what was available in Arabic and Farsi. But yeah, I'm sure there must be a wealth of writings in Urdu. I can imagine.
Any final questions? Otherwise, yep.
At the moment, not a current. I'm editing what I've translated previously. So the one that's inshallah due to come out not too far in the future is Tafsiratul Muta'allimin by Allama Hilli. So it's Allama Hilli's Risala. So yeah, inshallah, once it's done editing.
Nazmina, thank you. There is one genre which probably you have come across but not seen. And these are people who have been involved in actual Islamic movement. So I have three people in mind. One is Said Qutb, Fizal al-Quran, then Maulana Maududi, which is Quran, and then Ayatollah Talagani. These three tafsirs are very different in character because they are talking of a dynamic implementation of Islam from the Quranic point of view. I don't know if you have looked at them.
So I haven't looked at them. I have heard of them. And were they to do with towards when after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and nationalization of the Arab states, and when Muhammad Rashid Rida were al-Manar as well?
Yeah, it's inspired by that, but it's much later. Because all these three are like last 50 years or so. And they have very similar dynamism in them and very different from historic tafsir, which were more static. These are much more dynamic. And probably there is, given the current situation, there's probably going to be more in that direction.
I find that I found a lot of that even in Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr's tafsir, that there's very much of a focus on the applicability of the Quran to modern day, to contemporary issues, to the human being as a social being, our political role, and things like that. Very, very much in Shaheed al-Sadr's works, even to a certain extent in Sayyid Fadlullah's tafsir, that dynamism is there.
Thank you very much. We will have to finish there. So, thank you very much again. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Always brilliant to have Nazmina come and speak to us, and inshallah she'll be here again not too far in the future. Next week we have Munzila Araza, who will be speaking to us on partial ijtihad al-juz'i in the thought of Allama Hilli. The week after we have Sakina Yaqub, who will be speaking to us about her book, Hearts Connect, Narratives of Love, Trust and Surrender. We have Madrasa continuing every Sunday, and a range of other programs which you can find on our website on sikkim.org.uk. So inshallah, please look at that and you'll be able to find out more. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.